Can I get a thumbs up from someone if you can see my screen?
Thumbs up.
Perfect. So for those of you who haven't met me before, or for those I haven't had the chance to meet yet, my name is Nick Wolf. So I am currently the president of Ruby Australia and a Ruby on Rails developer as well. So tonight my talk will be talking tech to the non-technical. So the reason that this talk came about was because I actually attended a very challenging family reunion where I was tasked with explaining what exactly is it that I do and yes, what exactly is going on with these newfangled computers. So tonight I will talk you through an example individual who we'll name Bob, and explain the very simple process of loading a website page. But we will aim to do this without using any technical references at all. Now, at the end of this, I will invite anyone from the audience to come up with something else technical, and then we as a group can try and brainstorm a way to explain it. So throughout this talk, I will be using a number of analogies. And the reason that I think it's really important to develop these analogies or to use these analogies is that they really help you develop your mental model of how various pieces of code will plug together, or the various functions that they make available. Now, throughout this talk, I suspect that anyone who is technical, for which I would include the entirety of this, the entirety of the audience here, will have moments throughout this talk where they think, well, hang on a second, that's not right. Technically, it should be this approach, which brings me to one of my all-time favorite quotes, which is, all models are wrong, but some are useful. So this is designed to explain a very simple process to someone with zero technical knowledge. And this can have two uses. So one, it does have the advantage of allowing you to explain it to the people in your social circle that have zero technical experience and are just curious. But this approach of using analogies also offers you the opportunity to explain to people that may be non-technical, but you are still working with. So certainly you may interact with people in product management or designers who can come from various ranges of technical knowledge. So we will start off with our hypothetical Uncle Bob, and we will begin by simply clicking on a link, which will make a HTTP request. So the analogy that I quite like for this, and all of these examples are just one example, and you can certainly, if anyone has other suggestions, I'm always keen to add more to the growing list that I'm looking at forming. But the one that I quite like for making a HTTP request, which, because we are confined to our challenge of using completely non-technical references, is going to your local library. So when you make your HTTP request, it is a similar experience or an analogy we can use is going to your local library and requesting a particular book. And one of the elements that I quite like about this particular analogy is that in the same way that when you make a HTTP request, you might get the thing you're looking for. You might get a 404 saying that this resource isn't available. You might get that, oh, well, I'm sorry, but you're unauthorized to borrow an additional book, or you're not authorized to borrow this particular book because you need to have been with the library for a longer membership. I guess it depends. But I think this concept of requesting a resource allows even the extremely non-technical to sort of understand, okay, that makes sense. I can follow through with the process that we are following here. So after making a HTTP request, they're going to see some CSS. They're going to see how the page is displayed. Now, the analogy that I have used for this one is actually that of an instant scratch it, because all instant scratch it or scratchy tickets generally have the same underlying information. They'll have sort of the text that needs to be displayed. But as we see, if we head down to our local newsagent or wherever it is that you would like to purchase one, they can be colored and framed in many different ways, but the underlying information is always going to be very much the same. Now, CSS obviously has an insane amount of power and complexity that it can use, but many individual users are just going to see it as, oh, this is something that just influences the visuals of the information that I am seeing. Now, after we've made it to CSS, let's assume that our website is using React. Now, React is a slightly more complicated concept, and often something like this may be beyond the scope of what you would be discussing with a wayward uncle that is just looking to understand the various jargon that they have seen thrown around the internet. But an analogy we can use here is actually that of a picnic. Now, with a picnic, you will often have each individual food sort of separate and containerized. And in the event that a particular piece of food at your picnic was suddenly to be realized to be stale, it is unlikely you would throw out the entire picnic. Instead, you are likely to just focus on refreshing that individual element, which will help conceptualize some of the elements or containers that we see represented through React. Now, after we've made it sort of through the front end, then we're potentially going to start heading towards the database. Now, the database analogy, I always find, this was the part of my talk that I found the most challenging to try and visualize without using anything technical. Now, the analogy that I've picked at this stage is that of sort of a logbook or a physical spreadsheet, because in the same way that a logbook or a spreadsheet sort of holds the various pieces of information and can be updated a database functions along a similar way. Now, I think that most people at this stage have likely had some degree of experience with an online spreadsheet. So potentially, if there was one point at which you could look at introducing some a technical reference to try and help people understand some of the various stages or building blocks that are used in technology, then I think this is probably the one that I would pick. Because I do think having visualizing a spreadsheet, visualizing a database as a spreadsheet is probably the easiest jump of the various stages for someone who is completely non-technical. After database, we get on to something that is close to my heart and probably close to everyone else's, Ruby on Rails. Now, how to explain Ruby on Rails to a family member is, or a family member or someone non-technical, has really been an interesting experience for me, because going through a family reunion where, oh, I'm a Ruby on Rails developer, has been a frequent discussion I've needed to have. And the example that I now lean on for explaining what is Ruby on Rails and how a person can conceptualize a framework like Ruby on Rails is that of a French romance novel. Now, I can tell from some of the facial reactions I'm seeing in the Zoom that this is a bit of a mystery, but let me explain why I've picked a French romance novel. So romance novels, as with many types of genres, will often follow a particular formula. Normally, you will have the two characters don't know each other, then it's convention that they'll probably meet, then maybe initially they won't like each other, and then there'll be some drama that will bring them together, and then eventually they will end up together. So it follows this sort of very standard set formula, and each element inside that formula can be adjusted, can be changed. And along similar lines with Rails, we see that it has all its defaults, its standards. And with Rails, obviously, each of those, depending how far you want to dig into the Rails code base, is adjustable or changeable. You can have it that the two protagonists of your romance have indeed known each other for years, or change it in whatever way you would like. And the second point, the reason that I've gone with a French romance novel, is that Ruby on Rails is written in Ruby. And in the same way that something that is written in French is written with a particular syntax, is written with a particular language, Ruby, along the same lines, represents a particular language, a particular syntax. Now, this one is probably my absolute favorite. This was the first analogy that I thought of that inspired me to really want to delve into this topic. And yes, this is definitely my favorite of the analogies. Yeah, it is definitely an analogy after my own heart. Now, after we progress sort of past the Ruby on Rails backend, then potentially we get down to the actual sort of infrastructure of where we're storing our app. So here, the next example is that of AWS. Now, AWS is obviously just one of the server providers. This can easily be replaced with sort of Microsoft Azure or the Google Cloud platform. But the way I've enjoyed representing this in analogy is to, I recently went through the experience of searching for a housemate. And so I've been thinking of the AWS service as somewhat of a landlord, in the same way that we can have a landlord who will handle making sure that the potentially the body corporate, or making sure that all of the computer infrastructure that we pay them for is working and storing the various information and is achieving the various elements that we want it to do. We can think along similar lines. Okay, in the same way that I pay my landlord to provide me with a place to stay and ensure that it is up to code, AWS or Google Cloud Platform or Microsoft Azure along similar lines fits an equivalent function. Now, at this stage, at the beginning of the talk, I asked if people want to think about what are some other technical terms that we might want to try and brainstorm some non-technical analogies for. Does anyone have any initial thoughts on things they would like to brainstorm? Feel free to unmute.
Encryption.
Encryption. Let's assume that we are talking about, so encryption, I am fairly fortunate in that it's a complicated one, but one of my friends has a go-to explanation on how to explain encryption. So the way that you can consider encryption is, let's say that I would like to send some information to Kevin, and we need to sort of figure out a way that we can communicate in secret without anyone else on the call figuring out what our secret code will be. Now, I need to remember exactly how the encryption analogy works. But what we will do is we will first, we will ask Kevin to pick a color, and he won't tell anyone what that is. He will pick a secret color, probably something something fairly simple. Now, Kevin would keep this secret, but let's assume that Kevin has picked the color red. Then I, on the other side, will pick my secret color, yellow. And then each of us keeps those colors a secret without anyone else knowing it. And then we will then decide through conversation, which everyone can eavesdrop on, a mutual color. So Kevin, what do you think about the color blue? Could we use that as our shared color? Sounds good. Okay, so then for this, for the specifics of this analogy to work, we need to assume that you can't sort of, it's not easy to separate colors. So I take my secret color, which is yellow, and I add that to blue. So I get my secret color of green. Kevin takes his secret color of red and adds that together with our shared color, which is blue. So he will end up with purple. So each of us has our secret color, and then give me one moment. I need to remember the exact order of how this works.
It might be easier to first explain symmetric encryption before you
attempt asymmetric encryption?
Well, I can always remember the asymmetric example, but I always struggle to remember the symmetric example. Brendan, do you remember the appropriate way of explaining the paints analogy? Because I'm aware my friends didn't come up with this.
It's something to do with when you mix two different sets of, like for the asymmetric one, when you mix two different sets of colors together, you end up with the same color from both of those mixtures, and that becomes the thing you use as the password or whatever to decrypt the data, to encrypt or decrypt the data, right? But yeah, I don't remember the process that they're explaining in that paint video about how you come up with that like complementary one of the
yes,
the complement to your individual unique color.
So I think I have remembered. So I have now created my green color, and Kevin has now created his purple color. Now, if I send my color over to Kevin and say, "Oh, here's my color, it's green," Kevin can then take his original color, which was red, and add it to green, and then I guess you add red and green together and you end up with sort of a brownish color. And then along similar lines, Kevin can then send his purple color over to me, and I can then add my original yellow color, and we will end up with the exact same brown because we have 1 part red, 1 part blue, and 1 part yellow. For anyone else who's listening on the call, if they've received my green color and Kevin's purple color, then they each contain sort of too much, they each contain too much blue, because it would have 2 lots of blue, because it has 1 lot of blue from Kevin's purple and 1 lot of blue from my green. Now, the way that encryption actually works is this would be this would be prime numbers in the hundreds of digits in length. But you can use that to sort of secretly communicate or secretly work out a safe communication channel. Yes, encryption is a particularly challenging concept to explain, but if that allowed us to end up with the exact same shade of brown, then potentially Kevin and I could use that to secretly communicate. Now, you may be thinking, well, this is all very good, but I take every opportunity to avoid family reunions. I never speak to non-technical people. All of my family are coders and have been for the past 20 years. So there is the question of what is the advantage of being able to think about your code in terms of analogies, even when it's just for your own benefit. One of the most famous astronomers, Kepler, was trying to understand exactly how it is that gravity works at the astronomical level. So what is it that makes Jupiter travel slower around the sun than Mercury? And he used analogies to try and understand how exactly it was that he could observe this different effect. The theory at the time was that each planet sort of was moved by a spirit. But he, in fact, tried to identify different analogies that would explain it. So at one point, he considered whether he should think about it in terms of light, that well, the sun is emitting light, and light is not reaching the far planets as strong, because when I look at a torch from closer or further away, so maybe that's why they're moving slower, is the sun transmitting energy to them. He then considered evaluating, well, what if it's heat from the sun? That's another way. He even considered, well, what if it's smell from the sun? He considered whirlpools. He considered viewing it in a similar lines as mops. He even considers, what if it's boatmen? And I love this story because he used so many different analogies to try and understand that he actually helped progress scientific insight by helping to figure out the greater understanding or concept around gravity and what it was that was causing this planetary movement. But if that example isn't enough, one of the facts that really stood out to me from a book that I've been recently reading called Range by David Epstein is that being able to have sort of a wide view of information, so not just being specifically technical, but viewing things through other lenses, seems to enable greater insight, or different perspectives can allow you to understand concepts, whereas if you were only looking at it through a singular lens, you are less likely to be able to derive that insight. And the interesting piece of research here is that they looked at Nobel laureates, scientists who have won the Nobel Prize. And one of the things that stood out that is a difference between the Nobel laureates and other esteemed scientists is they are 22 times more likely to be a dancer or an amateur magician or a performer. Like, they have aspects of their life, which means they view their work through alternate lenses. And that seems to enable better insights. So if you can think about your code in novel analogies, be that the librarian, be that the spreadsheet, be that the picnic, it can actually allow you to consider, what are the different approaches? If I was trying to figure out how to optimize checking out a book from the library, what would I do differently? And then what would that look like in code? So that details the benefit you can get, even if you're not talking to the non-technical. If you'd like to find out more, David Epstein's book Range is the one that talks about the benefits of generalists versus specialists, and an amazing place that you can find many examples of very trimmed down analogies of incredibly complex situations or concepts is the subreddit Explain Like I'm 5, where they will even try and explain negative feedback loops through the examples of sweating compared to the Federal Reserve or quantum physics, which is challenging to explain to a 5-year-old, but the community is really fantastic. Now, I have been Nick Wolf. If you would like to provide me feedback, I have a feedback link at nickWolf.com.au/feedback. You can find me on GitHub, Facebook, or Twitter using the handle Quintrino. I've also got my email on the screen now, which is contact@nickwolf.com.au. And the last thing I will say is that each year for my birthday, I encourage all of my friends and associates to complete a birthday survey. So if anyone would like to give me a birthday present, feel free to go to nickwolf.com.au/birthday, where you can fill in your best guess at how you think I'm doing. I am, as you may have guessed, deeply enthusiastic about feedback, and I'm always eager to hear more. All right. That covers everything from me. And with that, I will hand back over to Kevin.
Thanks, Nick. That was a great talk. Is there any questions? I can't believe you waited for the feedback form so late in the talk. Normally it's like your intro.
Well, true. Yeah, feedback at the very end. Very unusual for me.
Nick, I can see that Moitoi Louis has one review on Goodreads of 5 stars, which I assume is you. Could you have any more detail on the book?
Range by David Epstein.
No, Moitoi Louis, the romance novel.
Oh, so I actually found it is surprisingly difficult to find an image of a romance novel where it is clearly in French. There was also the problem that the majority of the romance novels were sort of shirtless dukes with a swooning female protagonist, and yeah, I think I was keen for something a bit less I don't know, stereotypical of that genre. So I haven't read that particular romance novel myself, but if the only review is 5 stars, then maybe that's a good sign. So I have realized now that I am no longer screen sharing that someone has suggested microservices. So does anyone in the audience want to take an attempt at trying to explain a microservice via an analogy?
I feel like there's got to be an education analogy, like a university the size of Melbourne Uni can't change things very quickly. And like there's a lot of stuff going on, but maybe like some of the smaller university offerings can be more specific and targeted. I don't know.
Yeah, I quite like that, because then you're not specifically limited to it sort of talks to the strengths of a microservice being easily adaptable. The other one that I've heard, which applies, I think, to microservices, but I originally heard described in terms of large companies versus startups, is if you have an ocean liner and it's sort of traveling in its set direction, the ocean liner can somewhat represent the monolith. And then if you have a speedboat that is sort of chained to the back, if it speeds away in the opposite direction, it's not going to make any difference. But it can certainly, when detached, be more agile at constantly adjusting. And yeah, I think you can see a monolith or an ocean liner in this instance. It's often a fair bit of hassle to bring them into port, whereas a speedboat could be used to very easily ferry passengers or resources back and forth. But yeah,
it'd be more that, like, you know, you have a bunch of speedboats all talking to each other somehow. But does that work?
Radio.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, you could have multiple speedboats that are all centrally focused on delivering stuff to the I guess another example that I can think of would be that of sort of an ant nest, where you have the
That's exactly what I was just thinking. All the little ants. Yeah. Micro.
yeah.
Amazon deliveries via either A380 or via drone.
And then yeah, you could potentially look at, oh well, how do ants organize their nests so that it's easy for them to handle their resources. I don't know that there's any particular insight there, but yeah, you could potentially enjoy an afternoon learning about ants, probably not on work time. But then maybe that would lead to a novel insight on how you could implement your code. Yes, thank you very much for the suggestion.
School of fish, if we can keep doing suggestions.
What is it?
A school of fish travels together as like one big blobby unit, and then if they need to, they can all split off in different directions, compared to, I don't know, some really big fish. Shark? Shark.
Oh yeah.
Like a flock of birds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking about like jumpsuit versus pants and shirt for monolith versus microservices. Can't, sometimes you need a jumpsuit, sometimes you need swappable pants and shirt.
I was thinking more about was it you, Nick, said before, companies like startups versus big enterprise, but like supply chains. So all these companies are supplying various components to the other company as part of the supply chain of the thing they need to build, the app as a whole. But say we need a new component at some point, like you could, within your big enterprise, try and produce that component, but then what, you got to like source all these people from everywhere to like work on it, and then like do all the research from scratch or whatever. But like, alternatively, go to one of these little agile companies that are like focused on that one specific thing. They can sort it all out within themselves, and then like you just get the final product at the end, hook that into your supply chain,
and then away you go.
Because yeah, like trying to think about an explanation that kind of gets across the point of microservices as like that. It's the point of it is that to develop a new feature or something that like you want to be able to optimize for people working on different features in parallel.
Yeah, supply chain is a good one, especially like I think I don't have numbers, but I suspect that the number of people that are interested in tech that have their origins in business is probably fairly high compared to other areas, and therefore like using the analogy of supply chain or business perspectives would probably be well received. Yeah, certainly libraries was included in one of my examples simply because I'm just surrounded by librarians in my family. So yeah, it was one of the first things that I thought of. Yeah, whereas for people who have different sort of focuses in their history, will probably lean on the other things as well. And I think that's one of the things that allows each person to contribute something new, because whether they went straight to code or did something else before, they have an extra lens through which they can view developing code.
Makes sense. Maybe you should try to explain the same concept to different people with different background and adapt your analogy. So you got your librarian, your supply chain, your waiter in the restaurant. Well,
I remember a great talk that discussed model view controllers as, I think it was a shoe shop that I saw. Yeah, and I think there's so many different ways that we can view the same piece of information, but yeah, different people will click with it using different analogies. And so developing this ability to be able to break it down to its most simple elements and recognize something that matches up, yeah, allows us to better communicate regardless of the other person's technical skill.